Hey everybody and welcome back to Jim's Garage. In this video we're going to be deploying Traefik version 3. Apologies it's taken me a while, but let's fix that right now. So I'll go through all of the steps as usual. Please make use of the chapters below if you want to skip ahead to the configuration, and as always in the description below you'll find my GitHub with all of the files that you need to make this work. So let's dive straight into it and let's talk about some of the prerequisites and why you might want to do this. So as a bare minimum you're going to need to have Docker installed, and you're going to also need to own a domain. Don't worry if you don't have port forwarding available, things like CGNet, etc. We won't be needing that. And it's also worth doing this even if you don't plan to open ports and port forward applications. So why might that be? Well, if you've ever tried to self-host, you're probably sick and tired of having to remember IP addresses, ports, and also escaping browser warnings over certificates. With this deployment, you're going to be able to get rid of all of those warnings. No more pesky ports to remember, easy URLs that you can remember, and you can make use of this over and over and over on your own domain. Many of the benefits fall into the following categories. You can have multiple applications all running on the same port behind the reverse proxy, i.e. lots of applications will run on port 80, but Traefik doesn't care about that. You can just serve up the back end and it will sit on the front end. Also, it's good for security, especially when you integrate it with things like web application firewalls and also things like CrowdSec, for example, which will be able to inspect that traffic before it hits the service that you're running. So that gives us basically the crux of better productivity, better user experience, and enhanced security. So let's dive straight now into the configuration and I'll walk you through all of the steps. There are quite a few steps, but they're pretty straightforward and hopefully I'll do a good job of explaining it to you. So to help you out if you're starting this from scratch, I've created a fresh virtual machine over here. There's nothing on here other than Docker, which I installed using the same process as my previous videos. And I'm going to now install Portainer on top of that, which I've covered as well, just to give us a nice graphical user interface. You don't have to install Portainer, but I recommend that you do. Now that we've got those installed, we're pretty much ready to go through all of the configuration steps. So I'm going to head over into VS Code now and we'll get started. And just to demonstrate what I was talking about earlier, this is the instance of Portainer I have running on that virtual machine. And as you can see, because I'm accessing it through an IP and a port, we don't have a valid certificate. So part of this video, we'll get into fixing that. So over on that virtual machine, I have the following folder structure, which I use for pretty much all of my videos. It doesn't really matter if you want to copy my structure, as long as you're consistent through your compose files and your actual underlying folder structure. So in Docker, I basically put in here the permanent data, i.e. stuff that I want persistent between container reboots. And then in Docker Compose, you guessed it, I put my compose files. So within Docker Compose, I've created a Traefik folder, and also within Docker, I've created a Traefik folder. Now, there's a few files we need to get this up and running. Firstly, we need the Docker Compose file, which will give us all the configuration options for Traefik. And then we need some supporting ones, this config and traefik.yaml. Now, it's probably worth discussing the notion of static and dynamic configuration, which is what makes Traefik pretty special. These two files here are an example of the static configuration, i.e. if you make changes to these, you are going to be required to reboot or restart the container. However, with the dynamic configuration, where you've probably seen in my videos with the labels, for example, that allows you to dynamically, clues in the title, configure your Traefik. So the great thing about Traefik is you don't need to restart it when you're creating new applications, new services in Docker, and plugging them into your reverse proxy. You can spin up, I don't know, Gitty or something like image, and you don't need to restart the Traefik container. You simply add the labels and Traefik will pick it up. We'll demonstrate that later. So to begin the file review, let's have a look at the Docker Compose file, because this basically makes reference to all of the other files that we're going to need to create and amend, etc. So the first thing I've done here is to create a secret section. Now that's because we're going to reference CF token, and we're going to reference that to the file cf-token, which you can see here. The / notation means that it's local to the compose file, so it can read it. We don't need the full file path. And the reason I need this is because I'm going to be using Cloudflare for my provider. I have put a link below for where you can find information for all providers, so you don't have to just use Cloudflare for this, but I think they're a pretty good provider, so that's why I use them. If you click on that link, and do be aware you'll need your sunglasses, you can find instructions and the associated environment variables on this column here for loads of different providers. We'll be referencing that later on in the Docker Compose file, but let's continue. So this image we're using is the latest, so I generally recommend the latest tag for something like a proxy. It's a good idea to have your proxy up to date because of security reasons. And this should pull, as of time of recording this, version 3.3. Now you can pin that if you wanted to, but again I recommend you leave it as latest. We're putting security options to be no new privileges true. That's good for security in case this gets compromised. It shouldn't be able to escalate privilege and do naughty things on the host. Albeit you've probably got problems already even if this has been compromised, i.e. it can probably see what's going through the proxy, all of that traffic anyway. The next is where we actually reference that secret. So as I'm clicking on here, you can see it's highlighted up here. So we're referencing CF token, which is this file up here, and it's where we'll be pasting the value later on in the video. We're also going to be using an environment variable file. The reason for that again is because we have the secret credential for the Traefik dashboard. That's right, Traefik does have a dashboard. You can log into it, it's read-only, but it's really good to be able to see all your services, networks, etc. working. Speaking of networks, we have the proxy network. Now, I call this one proxy because it's a proxy, and basically any stack you spin up on Docker is going to create its own network stack. Now, we're going to define this later on, and we're also going to be using this for any other container we want to run through the proxy. So if you have a look on my GitHub, for example, every time I use the proxy, you'll see that we also put that container onto the proxy network. That means it can communicate with Traefik, and that's the way it basically works. Next up, we've got the port section. And by default, port 80 and 443 are what you would expect. HTTP and traditionally HTTPS traffic. Now, Traefik does support additional ports that you can add to it, and you'll be able to use different protocols on it as well if you want. For example, previously I've run WireGuard through Traefik on port 10,000, so I'm going to leave those in just so you can see that you can add additional ports if you wanted to. Next, we get into the environment variable section, and here we're using the Traefik dashboard credentials variable, and we're going to reference it with this file name here, or this variable name, which will point to this .env file here. So within the .env file, we will have Traefik dashboard credentials, and we'll generate a username and password for that later, which will get passed through to this container at runtime. Next up, we need to put in our Cloudflare API email. Now, you could put that in here, or you could also put that in the env file, depending on whether you want that email to be visible or not. And also, we're not going to be using the token. So if you want to, and you don't want to use the file, you can just paste your token in here, and that will work no problem. But if we're trying to get more into how you would do it in production, you would typically want to put it into a file and then keep that local and safe. I.e., you could then put this Docker Compose file somewhere up in the cloud or on your Git repository. Then you could pull it safe in the knowledge that your password is going to stay in this file here, which isn't up on that server, isn't visible to other people. The risk is if somebody got your Cloudflare API token and you haven't restricted that access, they could basically redirect your traffic, and a whole host of other nasties that you really don't want to happen. Next up, we're going to be setting some volumes. Here we're just giving it access to the local time. We're giving it access to the Docker sock. We're doing the Traefik YAML, which you can see over here. And we've also got the acme.json. This will be the certificate that it pulls later on that will give you that encryption. We've got the config file, again, which is up here. And we've also got some logs if we want to pass logs from Traefik into it. You'll need to set that up as well within the config, which we'll come on to later in the video. After that, we get onto labels, and you're going to have to get pretty comfortable with labels because that's basically how Traefik works. Now, there is the concept of there is static configuration and dynamic configuration, and to me, that's why Traefik is so powerful. We have static configuration, so you can see examples of that with the config and the Traefik.yaml, and that's pretty much what it says on the tin. These are read at runtime, so when you spin the container up, i.e. if you change a variable within the config file or the Traefik file, you're going to have to restart the container for those to be picked up. The beauty of labels is they are dynamic. So whenever you want to add a new service to Traefik, i.e. you want to put Pi-hole through it, or you want to put something like image through it, you only need to add the labels to that Docker Compose file for those services, and when you spin them up, Traefik automatically picks those up and it starts working. You don't have to reboot your proxy, which is awesome. Other proxy solutions out there, things like Nginx for example, each time you make a change you have to reboot every time, which can get a bit frustrating, and you will obviously have some downtime. Whether or not that's an issue, you'll have to decide. So having a quick look through the labels, here you can see that we've got an entry point for HTTP, that relates to that port 80 up there, and we also have another one which is down here, HTTPS, you guessed it, port 443. We're going to have a host, so the host basically is what you want the URL to be. And we'll be adding this URL to our DNS resolver later on. So for example, for me, that would be my Pi-hole, but you could also use anything you've got, say Unify or a OpenSense or whatever it is. We're going to need some basic authentication, and as I mentioned before, this is where we're referencing those Traefik dashboard credentials, and you can see those up here. That's going to give us a authentication to log into the dashboard. We're setting up a redirect scheme, so hopefully anytime somebody visits this on port 80, they're automatically going to be redirected to port 443. The reason we want that is because then that traffic's encrypted using our certificate that we're going to pull. We're saying that we're automatically going to forward that protocol from HTTP to HTTPS. We're setting up a middleware for a redirect, and then we specify basically where it's going to go. So we take it from HTTP, we turn it into HTTPS, and then basically we do the same thing. So we give it, again, the same URL because it's the same thing, it's the same endpoint, the same service, the same dashboard. But on this time we say that TLS is true, so it's going to use that certificate. We also say if we're using a certificate, we need to have a certificate resolver. And because I've got Cloudflare, that's what I'm calling mine, that's going to resolve anything to do with the encryption of the certificate on the web server. I've then added the domains that I want to use, so for this I'm going to be pulling down a wildcard certificate. The reason I do that is because then I can basically have piehole.gymsgarage, unify.gymsgarage, opensense.gymsgarage. You get the idea. If we don't pull down a wildcard, we'll have to do that each time, which can be good. There are advantages and disadvantages to wildcards. I'll let you decide which one you want to do. And then we also want to serve up the internal API for Traefik so that we can plug into it and read it. If you've got, say, things like homepage, for example, on your dashboard, you'll be able to plug into Traefik and you'll be able to see how many services are up and running. Lastly, we've got the proxy network. So on that, for example, I can set this to external true. If I set that to external true, it means that I need to create the network first. If I comment this out, as I mentioned here, it will create the proxy network for us, but we won't have any control over it. We're not actually going to have any control in the way I do it. We're just going to do a sudo docker create network proxy, and that should do it. But if we wanted to, we could create it within the compose file. Also importantly, every time we spin up, and we'll see this later, a new service, we're going to need to put external true, because you basically put external true when that network already exists. So if we spin up Pi-hole, we know that the proxy network already exists because we are creating it here. So we say external true. So that's the end of the Docker Compose file. Now we're going to go through the actual deployment process for this, and we'll check out some of the other configuration files on the way. Now a quick look through the other configuration files before we get this up and running. So if we head over to the traefik.yaml, here you'll see that we've got some funny looking things. We've got the API dashboard. So I mentioned before, that's why we're creating that dashboard password. That's to access the dashboard. For that to be accessible, the dashboard needs to be on, right? So dashboard true. Next we get to the entry points. So as we mentioned over here, you can see the ports, this 80 and 443. We need to specify those in a language that Traefik understands. So just opening the port, that's great, it can listen, but we need to tell it to listen. So this is where we say the HTTP port, and this will be the name that it shows up as in the dashboard. We've set that to port 80. Then we've set the redirection to HTTPS, which if you remember in the labels down here, that's basically what we were doing there. Now I've also got in here some middlewares. Now I'm not going to cover that in this video, but please do go and check out my CrowdSec video. Again, that's one of the benefits of using something like Traefik, where we can plug in additional things for security, web application firewalls. This is how you would add a middleware into that entry point. Next we have the HTTPS one, and again that's already using TLS, i.e. HTTPS, so we don't need to do that redirection. I've also added here some additional ones. So for example, if you were using those other ports for different entry points, for example, you could have a TCP one here on 10,000, or in my case, when it was WireGuard, that would be a UDP for WireGuard, and you would just set them up like that. Again, those entry points should then show in the dashboard, and we'll have a look at that later. I put the service transport to insecure skip verify true, so hopefully when we don't have a valid certificate, and we'll do that in some testing, that should just skip it. Next we have the providers, and the endpoint for that will be the Docker SOC. It's not exposed by default, and what this will help to do is allow Traefik to see new containers that spin up, and also then via the label system it should be able to then start routing traffic and see which ones want to be served by Traefik itself. Next up, we've then got a configuration file. Now the reason I've added this is because it makes tweaks to the Traefik setup. So by default you won't always get an A+ rating, and if you are going to set this up and expose it to the internet, go and check out SSL Labs/SSL test to make sure that you get an A+ rating. And basically what this does is it provides additional settings for that HTTP, so these middlewares. So it basically sets a load of things specific to how it handles the SSL termination, etc., how it behaves from a security standpoint. So things like cross-site scripting, etc., filtering, frame denies, all of those sorts of things. You might want to just disable that for starting with and then put it on as you need to. Things like this can break some applications, so you might need to come back in here and tweak some of those values, turn them off, etc. But I'm putting that in just as a little bonus. Next up, we've actually got that certificate resolver, and if you remember back in my compose file, we've got the cert resolver here and I've called it Cloudflare. So in here, I've specified what Cloudflare is, and then we're going to need to provide our email address. Now this is for Cloudflare. To go back to that website I mentioned before if you're using a different provider. We're going to specify the storage for the certificate it's going to pull as acme.json. We're going to do a DNS challenge. Now I haven't spoken about DNS challenges before. Now there's typically two ways in which you can validate that you own a domain. So for example, jimsgarage.co.uk, I own that domain. Now you can do an HTTP challenge, and what that will mean is you need to have port 80 open. So Traefik will go out to Cloudflare and try to connect back and make sure that you are on the IP you say you are. Now with a DNS challenge, all we're going to be doing is, because we've provided access to our Cloudflare API, Traefik can connect to Cloudflare and it can basically add a record to itself, i.e. it can add a piece of text it generates into Cloudflare, and because Traefik created it and it put it into Cloudflare, it can then check Cloudflare and say, does that piece of text I gave, does it belong to jimsgarage.co.uk? If it does, great, you own it, right? So then it can pull down a valid certificate. The reason I prefer the DNS challenge is because we don't need to have any ports open. So if you're behind CGNAT or you just simply want to use Traefik internally with a valid certificate, DNS challenge is the perfect way to do it. The resolvers we're using is Cloudflare itself. That's all straightforward. And at the bottom, we've just specified where we want to put some logs and some access logs. So this will create logging that you can have on your endpoint, and it will store it in this location here. Now that can get quite big quite quickly, so you might want to just turn that off in the future. But it's good for doing some initial diagnostics if we need to troubleshoot. So now we have everything understood in terms of the config and how that's all pinned together. We now need to go and create some things externally to plug into this. So let's now head over to Cloudflare. You'll obviously have to change this to your provider, but Cloudflare and others should be pretty similar. We're going to generate our API keys. We're going to save those into the respective areas, and then we're good to go. So when you've created and you own a domain, you want to head into the API token section within Cloudflare, and you want to create a new token. Now there's quite a few ways in which you can do this, but the one we want to do is edit zone DNS, so we'll click on that one. And then what do we want to do? Well, there's actually quite a lot we can do in here, but I want to keep this specific for security reasons. So we want to do a zone, and it wants to be DNS, and we want to select what do we want it to do. So we need to add edit, and the reason we need edit is because Traefik is going to use our API credentials to add some text to our domain so it can verify that we own it. Now the zone resources, we need to say what do you want. I'm going to say include, and it's going to be a specific zone. albeit if you wanted to, you could do all zones with a specific zone, and then going to select which domain I want it to work on. So if you had multiple domains all provided by Cloudflare, you could select which one you want. So here I've selected jimsgarage.co.uk. So hopefully now nothing else, even if that token were to be compromised, it couldn't edit any of my other domains that I own. Now on here, for example, you can also do some further security if you want. This limits the client IP addresses that can use the API token. That's a good way if you did lose your API credentials. If it's tied specifically to your server, then great. Hopefully they shouldn't be able to use it. But at the same time, for a home setting where you have dynamic IPs, etc., that's probably not a good idea, because it's not going to be able to automatically pull new certificates every 3 months because you won't have the same IP address. So once you've done that, we want to continue to the summary. And then we want to create the token. When we get the token, we want to copy it, and it's not going to show this again. So make sure that you do keep a record of it. If you do lose it, obviously go back and create a new one. But we want to head back now, and we want to paste that into our configuration file for that CF token. So now in that CF token file, we want to paste that in, and we want to save that. And now we know that when it comes to using that token, so for example here, it's going to pull the secret. That secret's then going to relate to that file, and that's what we've just created over here. Great. The last thing really we need to do is to, in the environment file, create now our dashboard password. So let's dive straight into that. Now for that, we're going to have to use an application called htpasswd. So if you fire up the terminal, we want to do the following command. We want to install Apache 2 utils if we don't already have it. Now I think on this version of Ubuntu server I'm using, oh no, I'm wrong, because it's probably a minimized cloud instance. That's now installed. So now we have that installed, we can actually go and generate a new password. Now to use the htpasswd we just installed, we need to echo, so spit out the command of htpasswd, and I'm just calling my user admin because this is going to be the administrator for Traefik. When I do that, it should prompt us to create a password. So for this, I'm going to use the awesomely secure password as my password. And once I've confirmed that, hopefully we should get a string. Yeah, we do. Excellent. So what we want to do is copy this here. And then we want to go to the environment file, and we want to just paste that in here. Now you can see that that's pasted in there, so we want to save it. And now when the Docker Compose comes along, it should now be able to pull this here from that .env file. Now that we've got the password sorted, we need somewhere to store the certificate. Otherwise, when we run this, it's going to complain that there's nowhere to store it, i.e. that acme.json file. So what we need to do is basically in this Traefik folder here, we need to right click and create a new file. Or if you want to, you can navigate to the folder where you've got this located. And then we can do a touch and then acme.json. Now if we do an ls, you can see that we've got that acme.json here. But what we actually need to do is change the permissions on it, because by default it won't have the right permissions. We need to change it so that it's only got 600. If it doesn't have 600, it's going to complain that it's overly permissive. And when it comes to pulling the certificate and storing it, it will break with an error message in the logs. So if we do a sudo chmod, we probably don't need sudo because we created it as our user. We can do 600 and then we want acme.json. So now if we do an ls-l, we should now see that we've got read-write on the acme.json file, which is exactly what we want. So great, we've now created the acme.json. We've got somewhere now for it to download and store that certificate. Now that we've done that, we might want to set up the actual proxy network as well. So you can either do a sudo docker network create and then proxy, and if we hit return, that's now created that proxy network. So if we do a sudo docker network list, it should show it here. So yeah, it does proxy. Or if you wanted to, just within this Docker Compose file, if you scroll to the bottom, you could just put a comment there and that would behave in the same fashion. You can actually add additional parameters to this proxy, so you can set which kind of driver you want, i.e. it defaults to a bridge one here, and you can also specify IP ranges, etc. That's not strictly necessary for this, but if you wanted to, that will give you granular control over things like the address space, so that you can keep this as small as possible and you don't risk having overlaps and conflicts and ultimately running out of address spaces. Now, one last important thing before we stand this up is to do with the CA server, the Certificate Authorization Server. Now, by default, and when we run this, it's going to pull what is known as a production certificate. So this will use Acme and LetsEncrypt to pull down a valid cert. Now, if you've got everything right, that shouldn't be a problem and it should pull it down. But do bear in mind that you can only make 5 requests, I think it's every 24 hours before you get a soft lockout. So it might be worthwhile doing a staging certificate and pulling that down. I've got this working my end and I'm comfortable with what I've got, so I'm just going to go with the default production. But when you're starting out, maybe try doing the test one first, and when you're happy and you've pulled down a test, simply comment this one back out and then redeploy the container to pull down the production certificate. Right, let's get into deployment. So now we should be finally in a position whereby we can pull down the container and start it up. So to do that, let's navigate to where our Docker Compose file is. So let's just check, yes, we're right. And then we want to do a sudo docker compose up-d. And with any luck, we should pull down the image and we should start the container. So here we go. You can see that we haven't found the image, so it's pulling it down. It's now starting the container and everything looks to be okay. It's now created this logs file here. And if we actually have a look inside the logs, we can see the access log. That should be empty because nothing's accessed it yet. And if we look in the traffic log itself, here you can see it's up and running. There aren't any errors. And if we scroll down, we can see that it's testing a renew of a certificate and it's pulled it down. So that's looking good. If that wasn't the case, we would have an error message in here, and if you've got anything wrong, any authentication, it will show it in this traffic.log file here that we've created. Now, I'm not going to show you this certificate because this one's still valid, but if I click on it, in here you'll see all of the details for that certificate. So if this is populated, you know that you've got a valid certificate. So now, fingers crossed, we should be able to now log in via the DNS record I created. So remember down here, traffic-docker jimsgarage.co.uk. I simply went into Pi-hole and I've added that. But now let's load up a incognito window and I'll see if this works. So hitting return, this looks promising. Let's put in admin and then password. Quickly grab the shades, much better. And the important thing is, if I now click on this button here, and I say connection is secure, let's have a look. So here you can see that the certificate is valid and is part of jimsgarage.co.uk. Jackpot. So now you can see everything we created, those 2 entry points, we can see those basic routers we created, the middlewares we had, etc. Great. Basically now you have traffic up and running. But let me give you a quick example of how to spin up now a new container that will take advantage of that. Let's use something as simple as Nginx, and then I'll also show you how to set up an external service. So taking an example of Nginx, which I've covered before, the important parts here really are that we have the labels, so these are very similar to before. We're now telling it that I want this Nginx to simply be nginx.jimsgarage.co.uk. That's going to work because we have a wildcard certificate. I'm load balancing it to port 80, which is the default for Nginx. Now you might be thinking, why is that port 80? That's unencrypted. Well, you don't need to worry because we've obviously got Nginx sat behind traffic, and anything that comes into traffic on an 80 will then go to 443 and be encrypted. So anything from the client, i.e. the user accessing the web page, to the proxy will be encrypted, and then that backend on the internal proxy network will all be done via port 80. So with that done, we should be able to now spin this container up. And with any luck, once we've added this record into our DNS resolver again, we should be able to copy this, paste it in the browser, and we're off to the races. So let me quickly spin up that container. That will now pull it down. We can open up our incognito browser, and with any luck we should be able to access it. So now pasting Nginx into the browser, we get a forbidden just because there isn't actually a website being served, but the important thing is if we have a look on here, you can see that the connection again is secure. So that's perfect. Now to get started with an external service, I've gone back to the config.yaml file that we looked at earlier. The first thing I've done is created a manual HTTPS redirect scheme, which always redirects to HTTPS and makes it permanent. The next thing we need to do is, and we need to make sure that this sits in the right indentation, is to create both routers and services. So we want to make sure it sits inside HTTP. Now I've created here routers and I've called it Portainer because this is the router specific to a Portainer. It comes in on HTTPS, so 443. I've created a rule called Portainer demo Jim's Garage, so that's the URL. It's using the middlewares that are up above, so these default security headers and the HTTPS redirect scheme. It's using TLS and it's pointing to this service called Portainer. Now the service Portainer is just below it, and basically the Portainer service is what actually sticks it to the IP address of the service you want to access. So now with any luck we want to save that, and because it's a configuration file we're going to have to restart Traefik. So now if I do sudo docker restart Traefik, that should restart, it should pick up this new configuration file and we should be able to access the service. I've added the URL, and if I hit return, that looks right. Well, it doesn't. There's a problem with the image. That's probably due to the security settings we've got on this. But if we actually look at the connection, the certificate is valid. Great. So we've now got an external service running through. And hopefully if I log in, we're now in. There are some problems. Like I said, I've probably got the settings too strong for the security. And I would normally just run this through labels anyway, but we are in and we're now secured behind a reverse proxy. So thanks for sticking with me. That was a lot of fun to get through, but hopefully now you've got everything you need to spin up Traefik version 3, create your own certificates, and then put both Docker services and external services behind that reverse proxy. That should give you peace of mind in terms of productivity. You don't have to remember IP addresses and ports anymore, and also you can include things like CrowdSec to improve the security of the service. As always, if you like this video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.